Bless his heart.
You think he's backsliding?
I think I saw him drink.
Yeah, but in moderation.
I just wasn't seeing much fruit.
He's going down a slippery slope.
How's your heart, man?
How's your heart?
I'm just such a words guy.
It was a total God thing. I'm blessed. Been working on my testimony.
Is that secular music?
We're opening with a secular song tonight.
Wait, is this a secular song?
Isn't she secular?
Which station's The Fish? 104.3 The Fish. Safe for the whole
Family. You know he's a believer. I think he's saved.
I just pray you would give him traveling mercies. Pray for all Tyler's unspokens.
Echo that.
Just really like to echo Tyler's prayer, Father. I echo that echo of my echo of his echo.
I really feel like I'm being released from this, you know?
I'm trying to be relevant. I'm just trying to be in the world, not of it. Hey, do you want to join our small group? You want to join my D group? You want to join my cell group, community group, access group, accountability group, Acts 27 group?
Dude, he brought it.
He brought the word. That service last night rocked me.
They're pretty purpose-driven.
Yeah, it's seeker. Don't they do seeker service there?
I feel like he's gotten really watered down.
I don't feel like he really teaches the word.
There's just not enough meat, you know?
Are they non-denom? We have a great Wednesday night supper.
Let's invite some dudes over and fellowship tonight.
We're gonna have a sweet time of fellowshipping tonight.
Dude, we had the sickest fellowship last night. We're going to Extreme.
Velocity.
Ignite.
Yeah, I'm going to Ignite.
The Edge.
The Dive.
The Bridge. The Ramp.
Fire.
Courageous. Passion. Echo. Reverb.
Noise.
Velocity. Drive.
Elevate.
Radiate.
722.
635.
419.
Orange.
Blue.
Yellow. Green. Clear. Neon.
Catalyst conference this year.
I don't do that because I feel like it ruins my witness.
Hey, Capre, this is Pastor Chris, and today we're going to be finishing up our series with the fourth and final week of Christian cliches that drive God crazy. Now, I've really enjoyed this series of just diving into some of those phrases that we use as Christians that sound true, but might not always be true. That maybe the language we use when we use these cliches can do more harm than good, especially when we're talking to non-Christians or people outside of the church. And there are so many of these we have not had time to get to, like the Bible says it and that settles it, or my mom's personal favorite, cleanliness is next to godliness. And if you want to explore some rebuttals to those phrases, I'll put a link in the notes to an article that does just that. But today, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most well-known Christian cliches. Love the sinner, hate the sin. Now, Adam Hamilton, in his book, Half-Truths, and I'll be completely honest, it's his chapter on this phrase that's kind of helping guide our sermon today. And I'll put a link to this book in the notes that you can also check out if you're interested in reading it. But he says, in his introduction to this cliche, it sounds so good, how could it not be true? But then he talks about how this phrase has been used and how there are times that this phrase has caused more harm than good. He says if you look at the origins of the phrase, it actually began hundreds of years ago with St. Augustine, who was writing a letter to a group of nuns about staying chaste. And he told them to have a love for mankind and a hatred of sin. So he kind of coined the beginning parts of this phrase, now in a very different context. But as time went on, it was used in a broader and broader context that didn't always apply as much as it originally did. So much so that at one point, Gandhi even said that hate the sin and not the sinner is a precept which, though easy enough to understand, is rarely practiced. And that is why the poison of hate spreads in the world. So today, that's the phrase that we're going to be taking a look at. Love the sinner, hate the sin. And we're going to do that by kind of breaking it down into three sections. In the first section, we're going to look at the phrase as a whole. In the second section, we're going to look at the second half of the phrase, hate the sin. And then in the third section, we're actually going to look at the first part of the phrase, love the sinner. And then we'll bring it around with a conclusion and application at the end. So let's get started. So let's take a look at the phrase as a whole. And to do that, I'm going to start by talking about something that's very near and dear to my heart. And that is chapstick. See, at some point in high school, probably between my junior and senior year, I was out middle of the winter and my lips got dry. And so I decided to pick up a thing of chapstick and I used it and put it in my pocket. And then as the day went on, I used it again and put it in my pocket. And I used it again and I put it in my pocket. And before long, I had developed a habit. And eventually my body decided that since you're using so much chapstick, we don't need to produce any moisture for your lips whatsoever. You can just rely on chapstick for the rest of your life. And I have. So much so that over the last 20 years since high school, I have developed systems to make sure that I am never without chapstick. I have a pocket chapstick that stays with me most of the time. I have a car chapstick that stays in the center console most of the time. I have a nighttime chapstick that stays on the nightstand most of the time. And I have a work chapstick that stays in my messenger bag most of the time. But the other day, something tragic happened. See, I went out to run an errand, and due to the fact that it's negative 30 degrees outside, I desperately needed to use some chapstick, and so I reached into my center console, and it wasn't there. So I had to use my pocket chapstick, and when I got done using it, I put it back in the center console. And then I was in the store and felt a need to use chapstick and reached to my pocket and it wasn't there. And so I knew I need to buy a new chapstick. The whole thing is falling apart. And I went to buy it. And my go-to chapstick, Burt's Bees Vanilla Bean, was sold out. And everything, the whole system, fell apart. Now, I will say, kind of an awesome little side note here, I posted on Facebook about it because I overshare everything. And someone out there, I don't know who you are, but decided to step up and be an angel. And I don't know how, but yesterday in the mail, I got a package from Target and it was a 4-pack of Burt's Bees Vanilla Bean chapstick. I don't know who you are, but you are amazing. Now, I bring this up because in the United States, in Europe, in the Western world, we love to compartmentalize things. We love to take things and put them into categories or put them into boxes. And you might think I'm crazy for doing it with chapstick, but you might have things that you do it with too. Some of you might have a garage tool set, and then a car tool set, and then a work tool set. And if a screwdriver ends up missing from one and in another, the whole system falls apart. Or maybe you have a living room phone charger, a bedroom phone charger, a car phone charger, and an office phone charger. And if one is missing, you have to steal one from the other room, and then it's missing, and the whole system falls apart. We love to compartmentalize things. But we don't just do it with stuff. We even do it with people. How many of you have work friends, and then church friends, and neighborhood friends, and then friends that you're only friends with because your kids are friends? Yeah, we put people into categories and boxes. And we even do it with ourselves. We love to talk about our emotional health. and our mental health and our physical health and even our spiritual health, as if the inside of our body was divided up into a bunch of sections, boxes, containers that we can put all these parts of ourself in, and they're separate from the others. And we like to pretend that we can do that with sin, that the rest of us can exist in all the other sections, but then the sin is put in this one box over here that isn't really a part of who we are. And that compartmentalizing is at the heart of the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin. Now, we all have different heroes. For me, my hero is Batman. For Pastor Dan, his hero is Martin Luther. And Martin Luther championed this idea that we are, as he would say, simultaneously sinners and saints. That we are both at the same time, all the time. And this idea has caught on. One of my favorite writers and speakers, her name is Nadia Bowles-Weber. And if you're going to be joining us on Ash Wednesday on our Zoom call, we're actually going to watch a short video from her and discuss it, and it's awesome. I encourage you to be there. But she loved this idea so much, she got it as a tattoo. And then when she went to start a church in Colorado, they named the church House of Sinners and Saints. And in her first book, this is what she said. We don't continually improve until we are so spiritual we no longer need God. We die and are made new, but that's different from spiritual self-improvement. We are simultaneously sinner and saint, 100% of both, all the time. And until we admit that we are both saints and sinners, that our sin is a part of us, not off in some box, but something we live with and experience, God won't be able to move freely in our lives and use our lives to advance the kingdom. See, our faith requires that humility. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to make some confessions. Now, the idea of confessing, the literal meaning of that word is to agree with. So when we as a church confess something, we are agreeing with something. And so I want to make this a little bit interactive. And so you're going to see in the chat pop up a little thing that you can respond to right now. And it says, I am a saint. And if you're watching and you can, I want you to click that button right now to confess that you are a saint. And you're a saint because of what Jesus has done. Because he went to the cross so that you could experience the forgiveness of sins. And because of that, you are a saint. So go ahead and click that now. Make that confession. Now you're going to see another pop-up that says, I am a sinner. I am a sinner because of what I have done, because I have fallen short. I have messed up. So I want you to click that now and make that confession. And hopefully, if we're doing this right, if we understand the concept, the number of replies on both of those should be equal, because we're all saints and we're all sinners. Now, just to have fun, I want to introduce you to another phrase. This is kind of a phrase that millennials coined, and that is the phrase hot mess. To say that somebody is a hot mess. Now, I actually went online and looked up and tried to see if I could find a true definition of this phrase. And I love what one person said. They said, a person described as a hot mess is attractive, but just barely keeping it together. Now, last week in Dan's sermon, he referred to us as God's masterpiece. That's what it says in one of Paul's writings, that we are God's masterpiece. Because of that, we are attractive, but I don't know about you, but because of my sin, because of my own shortcomings, sometimes I feel that I am barely keeping it together. So as one last confession that we are both saints and sinners, can we all just admit that we are all also hot messes? Yeah, we are. Now let's take a look at the second part of that phrase, hate the sin. Both the Greek and Hebrew words that we usually translate sin can be defined as missing the mark or straying from the path. To miss the mark or to stray from the path. That's what it means to sin. And we all do it. Paul says in Romans 3:23, for everyone has sinned, we all fall short of God's glorious standard. And if you think you haven't fallen short of God's glorious standards, you thinking that is falling short of God's glorious standards. So welcome to the club, sinner. That's all of us. Now, sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes we do wrong knowing we're doing wrong. Sometimes it's unintentional. It's a mistake we make that is ultimately outside of what God desires for our life. So it's right that we should hate those things. Nobody should love sin. The problem is when hating the sin becomes our focus, it kind of distorts how we see the world. There's this thing called the red car phenomenon. And it's the idea that you never notice how many people own red cars until you own one. After you buy one, you see them everywhere. And of course, that's true of every make and model and color of car you can think of, and even other things. You don't realize how many other people have that thing until you yourself have it. And if we become focused on sin, that can consume what we see in the world. Everywhere we look, we start seeing sin. And when that becomes our focal point, it's easy to fall into a place of judgment, of wanting to judge each of those sins or each of the people committing those sins. And Jesus makes it very clear in his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. He says it so plain. In Matthew 7:1, he says, do not judge others, and you will not be judged. Even Jesus himself says in John 3:17 that God sent his Son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. And if Jesus isn't here to judge, then we definitely shouldn't be here to judge. And so while hating sin is good, if you feel a need to hate sin, here's where you should start. By hating the sin in your own life. Christians have a bad habit of condemning the sins we don't commit. See, we want to point out what everyone else is doing wrong. But if you're only pointing out the sin in other people's lives and not your own, you're going to look like an idiot. No, Jesus actually says this. He continues that part of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7 by saying, and worry And why worry about the speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying something to your friend, let me go and let me help and get rid of that speck in your own eye, when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. First get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Now imagine going to the eye doctor with your friend. You guys were out doing something and they've gotten something in their eye, some speck in there, and it's really hurting them. So you take them to the optometrist to get it removed, to get it fixed. So you go with them, but you're sitting there in the waiting room with one of these sticking out of your eye. Yeah, you're going to look like an idiot. That's what Jesus is saying. If we become so focused on sin and seeing sin, we'll start to see it in other people's lives more than our own. And then we become judgmental. Now let's take a look at the first part of that phrase, love the sinner. Let me start by saying this. Of course we should love the sinner. There's no question about it. But see, Jesus never called his disciples to love the sinner. Those aren't words that came out of Jesus' mouth. Instead, this is what Jesus says. At one point, he is asked by a religious leader what the most important commandment was. And this is a question they would ask one another. It was a good way of judging where that teacher, where that rabbi was kind of on the spectrum, whether they were liberal or conservative, where they put their focus. You would ask them, what's the most important commandment? And based on their answer, you would know. It'd kind of be like asking a politician today, what's the most important part of the Constitution? And however they answered, you would kind of know where they were on the political spectrum. And so they wanted to do that with Jesus. So they asked him what the most important commandment was. And it says here in Matthew 22, 38 and 39, it says, Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Then he says the second is equally important. So it's not like one and then two. He says these are equal. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophet are based on these two commandments. See, Jesus didn't say to love the sinner. He said to love your neighbor. And Adam Hamilton, in his book, this is what he says. He says, I think Jesus knew that if he commanded his disciples to love the sinner, they would begin looking at other people more as sinners than as neighbors. See, when we do that, it begins to develop an us and them mentality. And when we do that, we start to place ourselves up here and everyone else down here. We become prideful. Now, as a pastor, one of the questions that I often get is there a ranking of sins? Is one sin worse than another? And there are a lot of debates over that. Theologians have different perspectives, and I'm honestly not 100% sure. Now, I can say that the consequences of some sins are greater than the consequences of others. But I don't know when I read Scripture if I see a definitive ranking of sin. But I will say, I see one that is usually placed at the top of the list. A sin above all the others. And that sin is pride. As it says in Proverbs 16:5, the Lord detests the proud. They will surely be punished. That is strong language. So strong that the Catholic Church, in their own doctrine, they say that pride is where all other sin begins. That's where every sin starts. Before any other sin happens, you commit the sin of pride, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. They would say that the first sin was committed before they ever got to the tree, before they ever held the fruit in their hand. They had already sinned by thinking they knew better than God, that they should have the knowledge of good and evil, that they should be the judge of that. And when they decided that they should do that instead of God, they were being prideful. And that was the sin that led to all other sins. It's this idea of being better than other people that's so easy when we latch on to this idea of love the sinner instead of love the neighbor. How many of you have ever been with someone who you know thinks they are better than you? Talking to them, spending time with them. It's miserable. They're miserable to be around. And I hate to say this, but a lot of Christians are miserable to be around. The kind of Christian cliche we use to refer to Christians like that are holier than thou. When you're around them, you just don't feel good enough. And if our focus, if our perspective is seeing other people as sinners, not neighbors, it's easy for us to find ourselves there, where we think we are better than others. See, there's this great story that I want to finish with this morning. You guys know that I love Billy Graham. I grew up looking up to him and still find so much inspiration in his story. And there's a story about him. It takes place in the late 90s. And he went to an event where Bill Clinton, the president, was. And he was speaking. And not too long before this event, he had been impeached for lying about an inappropriate relationship that he had. And that event had upset so many Christians. Growing up, remembering listening to Christian radio at that time, there were so many prominent Christians that detest what he had become because of that. And they wanted to separate themselves as far as they could from him. And yet, here Billy Graham was at that event, actually spending time with him, talking to him, discussing things. And on their way home, Billy Graham was in the car with his daughter. And his daughter looks at him and asks, how is it that you feel okay spending time with him, knowing what he's done, what has happened? And Billy Graham's response was so powerful. He said it's the Holy Spirit's job to convict, God's job to judge, and my job to love. God, I get chills just reading that. I love that mentality of love. And so each week, as we have talked about one of these cliches, we have tried to provide a cliche ricochet, as Dan called it. A different take on the phrase that might be more helpful for us in our faith. And so for this week, I think we get there by moving the period that we see at the end of the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin. See, we need to move it up a little bit. Actually, let's move it up a little bit more. Yeah, right there. Let's end that sentence after the word love. And so instead of love the sinner, hate the sin, let's just love. See, our goal this year is to go out into the world and to tell the world that there's a seat for you, that there's a place for everybody in what God is doing. But if we think of everyone as sinners, sinners are people in which you keep your distance, you pity. But neighbors are people you connect with and party. And if we want to change the world, we have to stop looking at the world as a bunch of sinners, but instead as a bunch of neighbors. So this morning, I encourage you to stop loving the sinner and hating the sin and start loving. Thank you guys so much for joining us throughout this series of Christian cliches that drive God crazy. May we think about the things that we say as Christians and how they might affect the people around us. And most importantly, may we, as both saints and sinners, love.